On my 78th birthday, my own daughter threw my wicker chair at me, and I fell to the ground in front of all my friends. The silence that filled the yard hurt more than the cracking of my bones, more than the shame searing my face. But what she didn't know, as she looked down at me with contempt, was what I'd been keeping in that old metal box under my bed for over a decade. What I did that early morning, with the help of those documents, changed the fate of all of us forever. Stay with me until the end. Subscribe to the channel, like it, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, whether at work or on your couch at home. It's good to know I'm not alone. My name is Eleanor Pritchard, and on the morning of my 78th birthday, the first sound I heard wasn't a happy greeting, but the distant, familiar chime of St. Philip's church bells. They tolled 7 times, echoing through the humid Charleston air that always felt thick enough to drink. I've lived in this house my entire life. A tall, narrow single house on a street lined with gas lamps and history. My bones ache with the same weary grace as these old floorboards. For more than a decade since my Arthur passed, the silence in these rooms has been my most constant companion, a presence as real as the scent of lemon oil on the mahogany. I made my way downstairs, my hand tracing the smooth, worn banister. The arthritis in my knuckles was a special kind of cruel this morning, a fiery reminder of every stitch I'd ever sewn. In the kitchen, the morning light slanted through the wavy original glass of the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. I measured the coffee grounds, 2 scoops, exactly as Arthur always liked, and the aroma began to fill the space. It was a simple ritual, a small anchor in a life that felt increasingly adrift. I was just a quiet quilter, a woman known more for her intricate patterns than for her own voice. That's when I heard the floorboards creak on the second floor. It was Brenda, my daughter. She moved through this house like a storm front, all low pressure and simmering anger. At 45, divorced and financially ruined, she had moved back in 2 years ago with my grandson, Ryan. I had hoped it would be a comfort, a return to family. Instead, it felt like I was living with a stranger who wore my daughter's face. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her bathrobe pulled tight, her expression already soured before the day had even begun. "Honestly, Mother," she sighed, her voice scraping against the quiet morning, "are we really going through with this little party charade today? Who are we even pretending to celebrate for?" The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly. She wasn't just talking about the party. She was talking about me, about my life, about this house she saw only as a prison of memories and untapped equity. That was the first blow of the day, a quiet, verbal shove that promised more to come. In that moment, the smell of fresh coffee suddenly felt bitter in my throat. I didn't answer her directly. There was no point. Arguing with Brenda was like trying to reason with a hurricane. Instead, I poured her a cup of coffee and placed it on the table, a practiced gesture of peace that had long since lost its meaning. "Good morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" I asked, my voice even. She just grunted in response, scrolling through her phone with a furious intensity, her thumb jabbing at the screen. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with all the things we could no longer say to each other. I felt a familiar loneliness settle over me, a loneliness that was somehow sharper when I wasn't actually alone. Ryan, my grandson, shuffled in a few minutes later. At 16, he was a gangly collection of limbs and teenage apathy, his face perpetually illuminated by the glow of his phone. He mumbled a "Happy birthday, Grandma," without looking up, but it was more than I'd gotten from his mother. I saw so much of Arthur in his profile, in the way his hair fell across his forehead. He was the only reason I still tried, the only person in this house who didn't look at me and see a liability, a relic taking up valuable space in a world that had moved on. Brenda, however, was not finished. "I saw the catering bill on the counter," she said, her eyes still glued to her phone. "For a few neighbors and dusty old friends? It's ridiculous. This money could be going toward repairs. This place is falling apart, just like everything else." Her words were calculated, each one a small, sharp pebble thrown at the fragile piece I tried to build each day. She wanted me to feel guilty for existing, for celebrating another year of life in the home my parents had left me, the home she so desperately wanted to sell from under me. I simply nodded, picked up my lukewarm coffee, and retreated to my sewing room. It was my only true sanctuary, a small space off the back porch filled with bolts of fabric, spools of thread in every color imaginable, and the gentle hum of my old Singer machine. The scent of cotton and beeswax hung in the air, a perfume of creation and patience. Here, surrounded by my quilts, each one a tapestry of memory, a story told in calico and silk. I could almost forget the slow, grinding erosion of my daughter's resentment. I ran my hand over a half-finished piece, the fabric soft under my arthritic fingers. I thought the worst part of the day was already over. I had no idea. It was just the overture. The Charleston humidity began to press in as the afternoon approached. It was a physical weight, sticking my blouse to my skin as I carried the old wicker chairs out to the patio. Each one groaned under my touch, fragile and weathered like me. I arranged them around the small iron table, my movements slow and deliberate. Arthur and I had hosted so many gatherings in this small courtyard, surrounded by the scent of climbing jasmine and the rustle of palmetto fronds. Today, the memories felt less like a comfort and more like ghosts watching me prepare for my own humiliation. Brenda's form of helping was to stand in the doorway with her arms crossed, pointing out everything that was wrong. "That chair looks like it'll collapse if someone breathes on it too hard," she commented. A cruel foreshadowing I wouldn't understand until later. "And are we really using these old chipped plates? It's embarrassing, Mother." I just continued my work, placing a small vase of gardenias in the center of the table. Their sweet, heavy fragrance felt like an act of defiance against the bitterness that filled my home. Ryan came out for a moment, unplugged from his digital world. He saw me struggling to open a stubborn jar of pickled okra and took it from my hands without a word, twisting the lid off with an easy strength. "Thanks, honey," I said, and he gave me a rare, small smile before retreating back into the cool darkness of the house. That tiny gesture, that brief moment of connection, was a sip of water in a desert. It gave me the strength to face the rest of the day, to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could get through this. My friends began to arrive around 3 o'clock. There was Mrs. Gable from next door, her laugh as bright and warm as the afternoon sun, and the Hendersons from across the street, who had known me since I was a girl. They brought small, thoughtful gifts, a jar of homemade jam, a new mystery novel, a potted orchid. Brenda played the part of the dutiful daughter, offering them sweet tea and smiling a smile that never reached her cold, calculating eyes. I watched her, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. She was a performer, and I knew the final act was yet to come. As my friends and I sat and talked, sharing stories and laughter, I felt a flicker of the woman I used to be, the woman who hosted parties with ease, whose home was filled with light and warmth, not tension and unspoken ultimatums. For a brief hour, I wasn't just a burden or an obstacle. I was Eleanor, a friend, a neighbor. The sound of their easy chatter was a balm on the wounds Brenda had inflicted that morning. I allowed myself to relax, to breathe in the familiar comfort of my community. Brenda circulated among the guests, her voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. I saw her talking to Mr. Henderson, a retired real estate agent. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I saw the way she gestured toward the house, the animated, almost desperate look on her face. She was selling, not the house, not yet. She was selling a story, the story of the long-suffering daughter trapped with an unreasonable, sentimental old mother. The air suddenly felt colder, despite the oppressive heat. Then, Mrs. Gable, a woman with a heart as generous as her famous pound cakes, leaned over to me. She patted my hand, her touch warm and papery. "You have made this house such a beautiful home, Eleanor," she said softly, her eyes genuine and kind. "You're the soul of this street, you know. We'd all be lost without you." Her words were meant as a comfort, but they landed like a stone in my gut. If only she knew the civil war being waged inside my own home, the quiet battle I was losing day by day. The afternoon wore on, a slow march toward disaster. The The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the flagstones. The sweet tea had been refilled twice, and the plate of pimento cheese sandwiches was nearly empty. I tried to hold on to the small joys, the taste of Mrs. Gable's lemon squares, the sound of a familiar story being retold. But the feeling of impending doom was a constant hum beneath the surface of the party's pleasantries. I felt like I was watching a play, knowing a tragic turn was written into the script. The ache in my hands had become a throbbing, relentless pain. It was more than just arthritis. It was the physical manifestation of holding on too tightly for too long. Holding on to this house, to my memories, to the daughter I remembered instead of the bitter woman who stood before me. I looked at my gnarled fingers, the fingers that had pieced together thousands of scraps of fabric into beautiful, coherent wholes, and realized I had no idea how to piece my own family back together. Brenda, who had been nursing a large glass of Chardonnay, suddenly steered the conversation toward property values. "Did you hear what the Petersons' place sold for?" she asked loudly, addressing the whole group. $500,000. And it's not nearly as historic as this one. The polite chatter stopped. All eyes turned to her, then, slowly, to me. I felt a flush of heat crawl up my neck. This was it, the trigger, the reason for her performance all day. I tried to deflect, to steer the conversation back to safer waters. "Oh, let's not talk about such things today," I said, attempting a light laugh. "It's a party, after all." But Brenda was like a dog with a bone. She saw her opening, and she was going to take it. The thin veneer of civility she had maintained all afternoon finally cracked, revealing the raw, ugly resentment beneath. Her smile was gone, replaced by a sneer that twisted her features into something I barely recognized. "Why not, Mother?" she challenged, her voice rising. "Are you afraid for your friends to know how you're letting this place rot? How you're sitting on a gold mine while your own family struggles?" Her words were a public indictment, each one designed to strip me of my dignity. In front of the very people whose respect I cherished. The air grew thick with a silence that was louder than any argument. My friends shifted uncomfortably in their wicker chairs, their eyes darting between me and my daughter. I felt trapped, pinned by the weight of their pity and my daughter's rage. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. I had to stop this. I couldn't let her destroy this day, this last shred of normalcy, completely. I put my hands on the arms of my chair to push myself up, to ask her, to beg her, to please stop. My voice was a dry whisper when it finally came out. "Brenda, please, not here, not now." But she was beyond reason. Seeing me try to stand, to assert some small measure of authority, seemed to ignite the final fuse. Her face, which I had once loved more than anything in the world, was contorted into a mask of pure fury. She took a step toward me, her eyes blazing with a lifetime of perceived injustices and disappointments that she had laid squarely at my feet. The sweet scent of the gardenias on the table was suddenly gone, replaced by the sour smell of spilled wine and old anger. She raised her voice, pointing a trembling finger right at my face. "You are the most selfish woman I have ever known," she said, her voice shaking with rage, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. The words hit me with a physical force, stealing the air from my lungs. And in that moment, as I looked at the horrified faces of my friends and the hateful glare of my only child, I knew my life, as I had known it, was about to be shattered on the flagstones of my own patio. The world went silent. For a long, stretched-out second, the only sound was the frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs, a desperate drumbeat in the sudden, awful quiet. The laughter and chatter from moments before had been snuffed out like a candle flame. My friends' faces were a gallery of shock and pity, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly agape. I was on the ground, the sharp edges of the broken wicker digging into my back, the indignity of it all a hot, searing brand on my soul. My hips screamed with a sharp, electric pain, but it was nothing compared to the agony of my daughter's betrayal. Brenda stood over me, her chest heaving, her face pale with a rage that had finally boiled over. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't gasp in horror at what she'd done. She just stared, her eyes holding a chilling emptiness that scared me more than her anger. It was Mrs. Gable who moved first, her soft, wrinkled hands reaching for me. "Eleanor, dear God," she whispered, her voice trembling. She and Mr. Henderson gently helped me to my feet, my body shaking uncontrollably as I leaned on them for support. The sweet, sickly smell of my own birthday cake, now a trampled mess on the stones, filled my nostrils. The party was over. There were no goodbyes, just a series of hushed, awkward murmurs and averted gazes as my friends gathered their things and slipped away. They couldn't look at me, and they certainly couldn't look at Brenda. Each quiet click of the garden gate was another nail in the coffin of my old life, the life where I was Eleanor Pritchard, the respected quilter, the gentle soul of the neighborhood. Now I was just a spectacle, a poor old woman brought low by her own child. Brenda had finally succeeded in stripping me of everything, right down to my dignity. Once everyone was gone, a new kind of silence descended upon the patio, heavy and suffocating. Brenda finally moved, but not toward me. She turned and walked back into the house without a word, the screen door slamming shut behind her with a sharp crack of finality. She left me standing there amidst the wreckage of my birthday, the broken chair, the spilled tea, the crushed flowers. Ryan had been watching from the doorway, his face a mask of conflicted horror. He took a hesitant step toward me, his mouth opening as if to speak. But then he just shook his head and retreated upstairs, leaving me utterly alone. With every ounce of strength I had left, I made my way inside, my hand trailing along the cool plaster wall for support. Each step sent a jolt of fire up my leg, but I refused to cry out. I would not give her the satisfaction. The house, my sanctuary, felt different now. The familiar shadows seemed to mock me. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a countdown. I was a stranger in my own home, a prisoner sharing a cell with her warden. The air was thick with unspoken violence, with the poison that had been seeping into the foundations of this family for years. I bypassed the living room, the kitchen, every space that held a shared memory. I went straight to my bedroom and locked the door behind me, the click of the bolt a small, definitive sound in the crushing silence. I sank onto the edge of my bed, my body finally succumbing to the tremors I had been holding back, the sigh. Pain in my hip was a dull, throbbing ache, a constant reminder of the fall. But as the physical pain settled in, something else began to rise from the depths of my shock. A cold, hard clarity unlike anything I had ever felt before. My whole life, I had been a peacemaker. I had quilted scraps into harmony, smoothed over arguments with a soft word, and absorbed my daughter's bitterness in the hopes that one day, the girl I raised would return. I had been accommodating, patient, and forgiving to a fault. I had made myself smaller and smaller to make room for her ever-expanding misery, hoping that my love could somehow heal her. But lying on the cold stone patio, looking up at her empty eyes, I realized my love wasn't a cure. To her, it was a weakness to be exploited. The woman who had tried to reason with a hurricane was gone. The mother who excused cruelty as a bad day had died out there on the patio next to the gardenias. For hours, I sat in the dark, not crying, but thinking. I thought about Arthur, my late husband. He was a kind man, but not a foolish one. He had seen the storm brewing in Brenda long before I was willing to admit it. He had worried about me, about what would happen when he was no longer here to be my shield. The silence from the other side of my locked door was more damning than any apology could ever be. It was his memory that finally spurred me to move. Not with sadness, but with purpose. My gaze fell upon the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed, a wedding gift from my parents. I knelt down, the pain in my hip a sharp protest, and lifted the heavy lid. The scent of cedar and thyme washed over me. Inside, beneath layers of quilts and baby blankets, was a small gray metal box. It wasn't locked. It never needed to be. I hadn't opened it in over a decade, but I knew its contents as well as I knew the lines on my own hands. I lifted the box out and placed it on my lap. It felt heavier than I remembered, weighted not just by paper, but by the promises and responsibilities it contained. Arthur had called it our doomsday box, a term I always found too dramatic. He had put it together in his final year, his hand shaking from his illness as he organized the papers with meticulous care. "You're stronger than you think, Ellie," he had told me, his voice a reedy whisper. "But strength is useless if you don't know what tools you have. This is your toolbox." My fingers, stiff with arthritis, fumbled with the simple latch. I opened the lid. There, nestled on top of old stock certificates and insurance policies, was the deed to the house. It was not in my name and Brenda's. It was not in a complicated trust. It was solely and unequivocally in my name, Eleanor Pritchard, as a direct inheritance from my parents, untouched by my marriage to Arthur. Brenda's assumption that she had a claim, that she was entitled to half of its value, was a fantasy she had constructed to fuel her own greed. Beneath the deed was another document, one that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a legal trust Arthur had established for Ryan, funded by his own life insurance policy and investments. It was ironclad, managed by our family lawyer, and designed to become accessible to Ryan only on his 25th birthday, or earlier for educational purposes, with my sole approval. Brenda didn't know it existed. She had spent the insurance payout she received directly on failed business ventures, assuming that was all there was. She had no idea Arthur had protected his grandson from her recklessness. I pulled out the last item, a thick envelope with my name written in Arthur's familiar, elegant script. It wasn't a will, but a letter, a final set of instructions. My hands trembled as I read the words I had memorized long ago. He laid out his fears plainly, his love for me and Ryan, and his deep, sorrowful understanding of our daughter's character. He urged me not to let sentimentality blind me to reality. "Your home is your fortress, Ellie," he wrote. "Never let anyone make you a prisoner within its walls. You are the matriarch. Act like it." A profound calm settled over me, displacing the last vestiges of shock and grief. It was a cold, quiet resolve that settled deep in my bones. Arthur hadn't left me a toolbox. He had left me a sword and a shield. For years, I had kept them locked away, choosing instead to offer an olive branch to a daughter who only ever saw it as a stick to beat me with. The humiliation of the afternoon was not an ending. It was a brutal, painful, and necessary awakening. Brenda had pushed me down, but in doing so, she had forced me to finally find my feet. I looked at my reflection in the dark window pane. The woman looking back was tired, her face etched with the lines of grief and disappointment. But her eyes were different. The soft, pleading look was gone. In its place was a glint of steel, a hardness I hadn't seen in myself since I buried my husband. I was no longer just a quilter who pieced together scraps. I was the sole owner of this fortress, the guardian of my grandson's future, and the final authority within these walls. I spent the rest of the night in my armchair, the metal box on the table beside me. I didn't sleep. I didn't need to. I was fueled by a new kind of energy, a righteous anger that was as clean and sharp as a brand new needle. I planned my stitches, mapping out the pattern of the day to come. There would be no shouting, no recriminations, just a calm, quiet, and irreversible severing of a thread that had become rotten. The sun had not yet risen, but my new day had already begun. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds, I rose from the chair. The pain in my hip was still there, a dull throb, but it felt distant now, a minor inconvenience. I walked over to my sewing table and picked up a pair of shears, the cold steel heavy and comforting in my hand. I wasn't going to cut fabric. I was going to cut a cancer out of my home. The time for absorbing pain was over. The time for setting boundaries, as sharp and clear as a freshly cut edge, had arrived. I unlocked my bedroom door and walked downstairs. The house was still, caught in the hush before the world awakens. I went into the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, the familiar ritual now imbued with a new significance. This was not an act of service, but an act of reclamation. This was my kitchen, my coffee, my home. The aroma began to fill the air, a scent, not of peace, but but of impending justice. I sat down at the head of the kitchen table, the seat Arthur had always occupied. I poured myself a single cup of coffee, black and strong, and placed the deed to the house and the trust documents neatly on the polished wood in front of me. I didn't need the letter. Arthur's words were already emblazoned on my heart. I was not the fragile old woman my daughter thought she could discard. I was Eleanor Pritchard, and I was about to rearrange the pieces of our lives into a pattern of my own design. I heard the floorboards creak upstairs. Footsteps. It was Brenda, coming down for her morning coffee, likely expecting to find me broken and weeping, ready to finally surrender and agree to sell the house. She would expect apologies or perhaps a stony silence she could rail against. She had no idea she was not walking down to confront a victim. She was walking into a reckoning that had been more than a decade in the making. I took a slow sip of my coffee. The liquid was hot and slightly bitter, and it felt like courage flowing through my veins. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime 7 o'clock, each gong a resonant, powerful note that declared the beginning of a new era in this house. I smoothed the corner of the deed with my thumb, the paper crisp and authoritative beneath my touch. I was ready. Brenda appeared in the doorway, her bathrobe pulled tight, a familiar scowl already etched onto her face. She stopped dead when she saw me. She saw the papers on the table, my position in her father's chair, the look in my eyes. Her expression shifted from irritation to confusion, and then to a flicker of something she rarely showed: uncertainty. The power dynamic in the room had fundamentally shifted while she slept, and she was just beginning to feel the ground crumble beneath her feet. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply looked at her, my gaze steady and unwavering, and held up the cup of coffee in a silent, final toast to the woman I used to be. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything that was about to be said, with everything that was about to change. She had started a war yesterday, thinking she was attacking a defenseless old woman. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. "Good morning, Brenda," I said, my voice perfectly level, calm, and clear. It was the voice of a matriarch, not a mother. "We need to talk about your living arrangements." Brenda's face, a canvas of morning irritation, crumpled into disbelief. A short, sharp laugh escaped her lips, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "Living arrangements? What are you talking about, Mother? Have you finally lost your mind? Did you hit your head that hard yesterday?" Her eyes darted to the papers on the table, dismissing them as just more of my sentimental clutter. The rich aroma of coffee, which I had brewed as an act of reclamation, suddenly felt like the scent of a battlefield before the first shot was fired. She couldn't comprehend the shift in power. She still saw the woman she had pushed to the ground. I did not raise my voice. I simply slid the deed across the polished surface of the table, the old paper making a soft, authoritative whisper. "This house, Brenda, is mine. It was left to me, and only me, by my parents. You are a guest here, and your welcome has expired." The words felt strange in my mouth, forged from a metal I didn't know I possessed. Her laughter died instantly, replaced by a dark flush that crept up her neck. She finally looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time, she saw not her mother, but an adversary. "You can't be serious," she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "After everything I've done for you, living in this dusty mausoleum, taking care of you?" The sheer audacity of her lie hung in the air between us, a toxic fog. She had never taken care of me. She had merely occupied my space, consumed my resources, and poisoned my peace. I met her gaze without flinching, my hands resting calmly on the table, one on top of the other. The throbbing in my hip was a dull, steady reminder of why this was necessary. "You have 30 days to find a new place to live," I stated, my voice as even as a perfectly stitched seam. "That is more generous than you deserve. You will pack your things, and you will leave my home." Her face contorted into a mask of pure fury, the same one I had seen on the patio. She opened her mouth to scream, to unleash another torrent of abuse, but just then, a floorboard creaked on the stairs. Ryan stood there, frozen, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something else I couldn't quite read. He had heard everything. His presence broke her momentum. Brenda's rage faltered, turning instead toward her son. "Don't you just stand there! Your grandmother is throwing us out on the street!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. But Ryan didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on me, on the papers on the table, and on the cold resolve in my eyes. He saw the truth. He had seen what happened on the patio. He simply turned, without a word, and walked back up the stairs, the sound of his bedroom door closing a quiet, definitive punctuation mark. That was the moment Brenda truly broke. Seeing that her son would not be her ally in this fight seemed to drain the last of the fight from her. Her shoulders slumped. The fire in her eyes was replaced by a cold, bitter resentment. "Fine," she spat, the word tasting like ash. "You'll regret this. You'll be all alone in this pile of bricks and you'll see. You'll be begging me to come back." She turned and stormed from the room, and a moment later, I heard the violent sound of drawers being slammed shut upstairs. The first step was done. The first thread was cut. The silence that followed was immense, a vast echoing void where years of tension had once lived. It was terrifying. For a terrifying hour, I sat at the table, my coffee growing cold, and wrestled with a tidal wave of guilt. A voice in my head, the voice of the old Eleanor, screamed at me. "She's your daughter, your only child. How could you?" I almost buckled. I almost went upstairs to tell her I didn't mean it. But then I felt the phantom pain in my back from the broken wicker and the ghost of humiliation on my skin, and I stayed put. The next few days were a strange, tense ballet of avoidance. We moved through the house like ghosts, never making eye contact, the silence broken only by the sound of Brenda's angry packing. I retreated to my sewing room, the hum of my machine a comforting mantra against the storm of my own doubts. I sorted through fabrics, my hands finding solace in the familiar textures of cotton and silk. Each snip of my shears felt like severing another tie to the woman I had been, the woman who would have apologized for being pushed to the ground. My first real stumble came on the third day. I saw a photograph on the mantelpiece. A much younger Brenda, maybe 7 years old, smiling a gap-toothed grin as she held up a quilt square I had helped her make. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. My heart ached with a fierce maternal grief for the little girl who was gone, replaced by the bitter stranger upstairs. My resolve wavered. I picked up the phone, my thumb hovering over her number, ready to surrender. But I forced myself to put it down, my hand shaking. This was not about that little girl. This was about survival. To fortify myself, I took my first concrete step into this new life. I called our family lawyer, Mr. Davies, a man I hadn't spoken to in years. My voice was thin and reedy at first, but as I explained the situation, it grew stronger. I told him I wanted to formalize an eviction notice and review Arthur's trust for Ryan. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then he said, "I'm glad to hear it, Eleanor. Arthur would be too." His words were a balm, a validation that I was not being cruel, but finally being wise. The external conflicts began almost immediately. Mrs. Gable came over with a casserole dish, her eyes full of a pity that felt almost as sharp as Brenda's anger. "I heard shouting the other morning, dear," she said, her voice dripping with concern. "Is everything all right? Brenda seems so distressed." I knew the story Brenda was telling the neighbors, that of the ungrateful, senile mother. I simply smiled, took the casserole, and said, "Brenda is making new arrangements. It was time." I didn't offer excuses or explanations. The old Eleanor would have over-explained, desperate for approval. The new Eleanor simply closed the door. That small act of boundary setting was harder than facing Brenda. It felt unnatural, cold. Southern women of my generation were taught to smooth things over, to maintain appearances at all costs. I was breaking a lifetime of conditioning, and it left me feeling raw and exposed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The old house groaned around me, and every creak sounded like an accusation. The fear of being truly alone, of having made an irreparable mistake was a cold weight in my chest. I was forging a new identity, and the process was painful, like setting a broken bone. I started a new quilt. It was a pattern I had never attempted before, a complex design called a mariner's compass. It required precision, focus, and a steady hand. It became my anchor. As I cut the sharp, clean lines of the fabric and pieced together the intricate points of the star, I felt as though I were repiecing myself. The discipline of the craft mirrored the new discipline I was trying to build in my life. I would rise at dawn, have my coffee at the head of the table, and work on my quilt until my fingers ached. It was a new ritual, one that belonged only to me. One afternoon, Ryan knocked softly on the door of my sewing room. He hadn't spoken a word to me since the confrontation. He stood in the doorway, shifting his weight, his eyes on the floor. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Are you really making her leave?" I put down my needle and looked at him, my heart aching for the boy caught in the middle of this war. "Yes, honey, I am." He finally looked up, and I saw not anger, but a profound, weary sadness. "Okay," he whispered, and then he was gone. His quiet acceptance was more powerful than any argument. Brenda's last week in the house was the worst. She oscillated between venomous glares and a cloying, manipulative sweetness. One moment she would mutter about how I'd die alone. The next she'd bring me a cup of tea, asking if I remembered the time we went to Folly Beach when she was a girl. These were the hardest moments, the old memories she weaponized to pierce my armor. Each time, I had to remind myself of the feel of the cold stone on my back, of the laughter of my friends dying in the afternoon sun. The day she left was overcast, the Charleston sky a flat, oppressive gray. A beat-up moving van was parked at the curb. I watched from the upstairs window as she and two men loaded her boxes. She never looked up at the house. It was as if she was trying to erase it, and me, from her memory completely. When the van was full, she got into her car without a backward glance and drove away. The silence she left behind was no longer a void. It was a clean, quiet space waiting to be filled. My first act in my reclaimed home was to walk out onto the patio. I stood on the very spot where I had fallen. The memory was still sharp, a scar on the air itself, but the shame was gone. The fear was gone. I looked at the flagstones, at the climbing jasmine on the trellis, and I felt a sense of ownership I hadn't felt in years. This was my ground. I had defended it. I had won. I went back inside and retrieved the broken wicker chair, carrying it not to the trash, but to my workshop. It was broken, yes, but I was a quilter. I knew how to mend things. The next few weeks were a journey of rediscovery. I moved my sewing table into the main living room, claiming the best light for myself. I played my old jazz records, the sound of Louis Armstrong filling the rooms that had been suffocated by Brenda's resentment. I started cooking again, not just for sustenance, but for joy, the scent of garlic and herbs chasing away the last of the bitter ghosts. I was learning to live for myself again, and it felt like breathing after being underwater for a very long time. My progress was not a straight line. There were nights when the silence felt too loud, and the loneliness was a physical ache. I would catch myself setting a place for 3 at the dinner table out of habit, and the pang of loss would be sharp and sudden. In those moments, the old thoughts would return, whispering that I was a cold, unforgiving old woman who had thrown her own child out. I had to fight these thoughts, batting them away like moths from a flame, reminding myself that peace had a price. A turning point came when Mr. Davies called. He confirmed that the eviction was legal and binding, and more importantly, he had arranged a meeting for me and Ryan to discuss the trust Arthur had left him. "He wanted you to be the one to tell him, Eleanor," Mr. Davies said. "He trusted your judgment." The weight of that trust, Arthur's faith in me from beyond the grave, solidified my resolve. I was not just acting for myself, I was honoring my husband's final wish to protect our grandson. A few days later, Ryan came to visit. He was staying with a friend from school, his mother having found a cramped, depressing apartment across town. We sat in the living room, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, the same dust motes I used to see with dread, but now saw as part of a quiet, peaceful life. I explained the trust to him, the money his grandfather had set aside for his future, for his education. His eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. "Granddad, he did that for me?" he whispered. He looked around the room, at my sewing project spread out in the light, at the vase of fresh-cut gardenias on the table. "Mom always said he left us with nothing," he said, his voice thick with a dawning understanding. In that moment, I wasn't just giving him news about his future. I was giving him back a piece of his past, a truer image of the grandfather he barely remembered. After he left, a profound sense of peace settled over me. I had not destroyed my family. I had pruned a dying, diseased branch in the hopes of saving the tree. I had protected my grandson, honored my husband, and most importantly, saved myself. The fear of being alone was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. I was not lonely. I was in solitude. And there was a world of difference between the two. The house felt warm again, filled not with ghosts, but with possibility. That evening, I went back to my sewing room and looked at the Mariner's Compass quilt top, which was nearly complete. The points were sharp, the colors vibrant, the design clear and true. It was the most difficult thing I had ever made, and the most beautiful. It was a map of my own journey, a testament to navigating the storm and finding my own true north. I ran my hand over the fabric, the texture a comforting testament to my own resilience. I walked out to the porch as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the church. Steeples of Charleston. The air was soft and smelled of salt and jasmine. I thought about the woman I was just a month ago, a frightened, accommodating woman who measured her worth by how little space she took up. She was a stranger to me now. I had been pushed to the ground, broken and humiliated, but I had not stayed there. I had risen, not as the same woman, but as the matriarch Arthur always knew I was. The first morning after the moving van disappeared, the silence in the house was a physical presence. It was different from the tense, heavy quiet that had suffocated these rooms for years. This was a clean silence, a spacious quiet filled with the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock and the distant cry of a seagull over the harbor. I sat at the head of my kitchen table, my rightful place, and drank my coffee. The air tasted clean. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't bracing for the sound of angry footsteps on the stairs. I was simply Eleanor Pritchard, alone in her own home, and the feeling was not one of loneliness, but of liberation. My first act of conquest was not grand or dramatic. I walked into the formal living room, a space that had become a dusty museum of Brenda's resentment, and I opened all the windows, letting the thick, salty air of Charleston pour in. Then, with a strength that surprised me, I began to move the furniture. I dragged my heavy sewing table from its cramped corner in the back room and positioned it squarely in the center of the living room, right where the afternoon sun would fall across it. This house would no longer be a place of waiting and enduring. It would be a workshop for my joy. That afternoon, I found my old record player. I blew the dust off a vinyl album of Louis Armstrong, and soon the sound of a joyful, gravelly trumpet filled the halls. The music was a defiant celebration, chasing the last of the bitter ghosts from the corners of every room. I had forgotten what my own house sounded like when it was filled with my own choices. The melody wrapped around me like one of my own quilts, a comforting layer of warmth against the chill of the past few years. It was the sound of my life, finally being played at a volume I chose. In my workshop, the broken wicker chair sat like a patient waiting for a surgeon. I didn't throw it away. Discarding it felt like letting Brenda have the final say on its story. Instead, I began the slow, meticulous process of mending it. I found new reeds, soaked them until they were pliable, and began weaving. My arthritic fingers protested, but I worked through the pain. Each strand I wove into place felt like knitting a broken piece of myself back together. The chair was a testament not to my fall, but to my ability to rise and repair what had been broken. That evening, I cooked a meal just for me. A simple dish of shrimp and grits, seasoned with the spices I loved. The ones Brenda always complained were too strong. I set a single place at the dining room table. Using my mother's good china, I lit a candle. It felt decadent, this simple act of honoring myself. As I ate, I realized how much of my life had been dictated by the tastes and moods of others. The food wasn't just nourishing my body, it was feeding a part of my soul that had been starved for far too long. A few days later, I saw Mrs. Gable in her garden. She looked over the fence, and the pity that had filled her eyes at my party was gone. In its place was something new, a look of quiet, profound respect. She didn't ask about Brenda. She didn't pry. She simply said, "Your gardenias are looking beautiful this year, Eleanor." And I replied, "Yes, they are. They're finally getting enough sun." We both knew we weren't just talking about the flowers. The conversation was brief, but it was a clear signal that the narrative in the neighborhood was changing. Of course, I knew there were whispers. I was the old woman who had thrown her own daughter out. I could feel the curiosity in the pot. Glances of the postman, the hushed tones of women at the market. In the past, this would have mortified me. I would have felt the need to explain, to justify, to make them understand. But the Eleanor who had been forged on the flagstones of her own patio no longer cared for the opinions of those who hadn't walked in her shoes. My dignity was not up for public debate. The most telling reaction came from Mr. Henderson. I saw him on the street while on my morning walk. He was a man of few words, but he had seen everything that day. He tipped his hat to me, a gesture he hadn't made in years. "Morning, Eleanor," he said, and his eyes held a glimmer of something that looked like admiration. "Good to see you out and about." It was a small thing, but it was an acknowledgement from one old Charlestonian to another that a line had been drawn and a fortress had been successfully defended. The contrast between my life before and after was starkest in these small social interactions. Before, I had walked through my own neighborhood with my head down, trying to be invisible, always dreading a conversation that might turn to Brenda and her troubles. I had lived in a constant state of apology for the chaos in my home. Now, I walked with my back straight. I met my neighbor's eyes. I was no longer the keeper of my daughter's shame. I was simply the mistress of my own peaceful home. One evening, the phone rang. It was Brenda. Her voice was a cocktail of fury and feigned concern. She accused me of being cruel, of abandoning my family. She told me I would die alone in that house, and no one would find me for days. The old me would have crumbled, her words finding every crack in my resolve. But I listened calmly, the receiver cool against my ear, and when she was finished, I said with a quiet finality that allowed for no argument, "I am at peace, Brenda. I wish the same for you. Goodbye." And I hung up the phone. Ryan began visiting for dinner every Sunday. He would arrive, not with the sullen apprehension of before, but with an easy smile. We would sit at the kitchen table, the way a family should, and talk. We talked about his classes, his friends, his dreams of studying architecture. He was fascinated by the history of the house, and I found myself telling him stories about his grandfather, painting a picture of the man he barely knew. We were not just having dinner, we were rebuilding a bridge, one story at a time. During one of those dinners, I formally explained the trust Arthur had left for him. I laid out the papers, explaining how his grandfather had ensured his future would be secure, that his education would be paid for. I watched the understanding dawn on his face, replacing years of misinformation his mother had fed him. He saw that he hadn't been abandoned or forgotten by the men in his family. He had been protected. It was a gift of truth that was more valuable than any inheritance. We started a new tradition. After dinner, we would work in the garden, together for an hour as the sun set. He had Arthur's way with the roses, a gentle but firm hand. In the shared, quiet work of pulling weeds and tending to the soil, we forged a new bond. It was a relationship built not on obligation or proximity, but on mutual respect and a quiet shared history. He was seeing me not just as his grandmother, but as a person, a woman with strength and a story of her own. I realized then that my greatest intangible achievement was not casting my daughter out, but creating a safe harbor for my grandson. I had not destroyed my family. I had saved what was good and true within it. I had cut away the rot to allow for new growth. The peace I had cultivated was not just for me, it was for him too. It was a legacy of stability and love, a foundation he could build his own life upon, free from the chaos his mother created. One Sunday, after he left, I found a small folded note on the kitchen table. In his sprawling teenage handwriting, it said, "Thank you, Grandma, for everything." I held the piece of paper to my chest, and the tears that came were not of sorrow or grief, but of a profound and overwhelming gratitude. In my quest to save myself, I had managed to give him back a piece of his childhood, a sense of security he had lost long ago. This was my victory. I often caught my reflection in the dark windows of the house at night. The woman who looked back at me was undeniably old. The lines on her face were deeper, etched by time and sorrow. But her eyes were different. The fear was gone. The pleading, accommodating softness had been replaced by a calm clarity. It was the face of a woman who knew her own worth, a woman who had faced down her dragons and won. I was finally, fully, myself. I would look down at my hands, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, the skin thin and papery. For years, I had seen them as a symbol of my own fragility, of my fading utility in the world. But now, I saw them differently. These were the hands that had created beauty from scraps, that had held a dying husband, that had signed the papers to reclaim my home, and that had mended a broken chair. They were not weak. They were the hands of a survivor, and they were strong. My mariner's compass quilt was finally complete. It was a masterpiece of precision and color, the most complex thing I had ever created. I chose not to sell it or give it away. Instead, I hung it on the main wall of the living room, a vibrant, commanding presence. It was more than a quilt. It was a map of my soul's journey. It was a declaration that even in the autumn of one's life, it is possible to navigate a terrible storm and find a new, true direction. I sometimes thought of the woman I was before my 78th birthday. A quiet, frightened woman who absorbed cruelty like a sponge, who made herself small to avoid confrontation. I felt a deep, aching compassion for her. She had done the best she could with the tools she thought she had, but she was a stranger to me now. I had been forced to burn that version of myself away to rise from the ashes, stronger and truer than before. I no longer felt alone in the house. I felt Arthur's presence, not as a mournful ghost, but as a proud, loving energy. I had finally understood the last gift he gave me, not the money or the house, but the faith that I had the strength to be my own protector. By acting as the matriarch he knew I could be, I had honored his memory more profoundly than any years of quiet grieving ever could. I had become his equal in strength, his partner even in death. Now, as I stand on my porch in the evening, watching the gas lamps flicker to life along the street, I understand something fundamental. A home is not just four walls and a roof. It is the sanctuary of your own dignity. It is the one place on earth where you have the absolute right to be at peace. We spend so much of our lives being what others need us to be, a mother, a wife, a friend, that we sometimes forget to simply be ourselves. The world will tell you, especially as you get older, to be quiet, to be accommodating, to not make waves. It will tell you that your time for bold decisions is over. But the truth is, there is no age limit on self-respect. There is no expiration date on the right to defend your own peace. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself and for the future, is to draw a line in the sand and refuse to let anyone cross it. True strength is rarely found in the loudness of a scream or the force of a push. It is found in the quiet, unshakable resolve to say, no more. It is the courage to choose the terrifying uncertainty of solitude over the slow, soul-killing poison of a toxic relationship. It is the realization that you are the sole gatekeeper to your own life, and you get to decide who is worthy of being invited inside. So, if you are watching this, feeling trapped in a story that someone else is writing for you, please know this: it is never too late to pick up the needle and thread of your own life. It is never too late to cut away the pieces that no longer fit, to mend what is broken, and to stitch together a new pattern. Your life is your own masterpiece. Do not be afraid to make it beautiful, to make it strong, and above all, to make it yours. I sit now in my living room, in my mended wicker chair, bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon. The scent of jasmine drifts in through the open window, and the sound of a distant church bell marks the hour. On the wall hangs my quilt, my compass. I am 78 years old, and I have never felt more at home. I am not just a survivor of a great storm. I am the woman who learned to navigate by her own stars. And finally, I am at peace.